Hi everyone and welcome back to the series. In this video I'll be covering test fitting. So from the last part, I've got my resin parts washed and dried. So the first thing you need to do before test fitting is, like a plastic kit, you need to remove the tabs. You'll need a pair of nippers, and I recommend getting cheap ones instead of expensive ones, because resin is harder than plastic and they'll easily damage more delicate blades. And you'll want to cut quite far away, especially on thinner pieces, as there's a tendency to take a chunk of the actual resin part off if you cut it too close. Once you've done the initial cut, you can do a closer second cut or just sand it away. I usually start off with 320 or 400 grits and then work my way up towards 1000. Sometimes you encounter a thin layer of resin like this, and you're supposed to cut it away. Make sure what you're cutting away is supposed to be cut away, because sometimes they can be easily confused with details, but they shouldn't be too hard to identify if you inspect them carefully. So on to test fitting. This step is quite important, especially for full resin kits, because in this part you can figure out all the fitment issues and instabilities, and this is best dealt with before you start painting. Usually you'll find fittings in resin parts quite loose, although for conversion kits they will stick onto the inner frame quite well, and usually you have no problem just using super glue to stick them on after painting. But for a full resin kit, usually parts don't stick together at all. There are two major ways to stick parts together. If your parts are small and you don't need it to move, then you can just use super glue after painting. But if your parts are bigger and have structural importance, like inner frame, then you need to use rods to secure the parts together. The most common rods people use are brass rods, because they're relatively strong but at the same time quite soft. If you need even stronger rods, then you can use steel rods, and usually thickness wise I like to use 1 and 1.5 mils. So basically what adding rods does is you're adding your own pegs and holes, so the parts become more snap fit, so to speak. So what you need for drilling is called a pin vise. Ideally you'll want to get a size below the diameter of the rod. For example, if I were to use a 1mm rod, then I will need a 0.09mm drill bit. The reason being that when we drill we tend to sort of move side to side, so creating a larger hole. But alternatively, you can just use the same size and then just fill in the gap with super glue. But as you can see, hand drilling can be quite tedious and slow, so I prefer to use an electric drill. Once you've drilled your holes, you can insert your rods and cut to size. Then, a great tip is to use a marker and then just draw on the ends of the rods. And then you press against the other half of the resin part that you want to drill holes to. This will help a lot with the alignment of the parts. And then do the same drilling on the other side. And now you can fit the two halves together. Note that you shouldn't use super glue on the other half, otherwise you just stick the two parts together. And if you drilled out of place and causing parts to misalign, then your only solution is to fill the holes with super glue, and once it's dried you can re-drill again. For parts that you know you're going to use super glue after painting, in the test fitting stage you can just use glue tack to stick it on. Sometimes you encounter warped pieces. You'll typically see this in long and thin pieces. Do not try to bend them back in place, because unlike plastic, resin will tend to break off instead of bending. The same goes to pieces that almost fit but are too tight. Don't try to push them together too hard because you'll most likely break them. My tip when it comes to resin is if it doesn't fit, it doesn't fit. To fix a warped part, you'll need a bowl and freshly boiled water. When heated up, resin will become pliable, so submerge your resin piece under the water, and depends on the thickness of the piece, give it about 10 to 30 seconds. And you can also occasionally just take it out of the water to see if it's soft enough. Once it's soft enough, you can just bend it back into place. And then once it's cooled down, it will be hardened again. So that's it for this part, and I hope that you have found it useful. Again, if you have any questions, just drop them down below. In the next part, I'll be covering sanding and filling. So see you in the next one.